If there's a political commitment, you can do it.
You have to consider the diplomatic timeline to negotiate this sort of process.
So the working group really has to drill down on how do we get that verification agreement signed.
Now, why do you think Secretary Pompeo promoted Vietnamese model for North Korea?
We're seeing a bit of that in North Korea now where there's more of marketization kicking in.
And they clearly do want to rebuild their economy. Kim Jong-un really would like to see the forms of foreign investment.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I am Eun-jung Cho. 1 month after the Singapore summit, Washington and Pyongyang are working to turn the summit agreement into reality. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited North Korea and a working group has been established. With little progress so far on denuclearization, we will discuss today if this is because of technical difficulties or the lack of political will on the North Korean side.
If those requests were gangster like they are, the world is a gangster.
Now, my guest today, Mr. Joshua Pollack, Senior Research Associate at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. He's also the editor of the Non-Proliferation Review. Also joining us today, Ambassador Joseph Detrani, former special envoy for the six-party talks during the Bush administration. Ambassador Detrani also served as the director of National Counter-Proliferation Center. Welcome to the program.
Good morning, Eun-jung.
Thank you.
Before we get into the technical side, I do want to start off with this question. If North Korea has sincerity and political will, is it so difficult to denuclearize in the technical sense? If any one of you can start us off.
I would say no. I would say, and we saw this in 2005 with the joint statement of September 2005, where North Korea committed to abandoning their nuclear weapons and facilities, and there was a process, and they started to do that, and we had monitors on the ground. So no, I would say no. If there's a political commitment, you can do it.
It takes a long time. If you are committed to this path, and if you can work out the ways and means, you still need to do it systematically. There are processes of verification, of cleanup. It's not just dismantling equipment and taking it home.
Regarding the time that's going to be needed to denuclearize, there are different estimates. And National Security Advisor John Bolton says 1 year. Secretary Pompeo says 2.5 years. Dr. Siegfried Hecker, who went to Yongbyon facility in 2010, he says 15 years. So what do you think, and what are the grounds for your estimation?
Well, I'll start, and I couldn't put a timeline on it right now. I think we would have to see a declaration. We would have to see what North Korea is declaring. How many weapons? Where are the weapons? The uranium enrichment facilities, they say one, there may be more. I think the sense is there are more than one. The plutonium, and the high explosive test sites, and when you get into mid-range, long-range ballistic missiles. So you have a universe of issues here. And I think one has to see that declaration and the personnel who are working those issues, and then you can extrapolate from that and make a determination of how long it possibly could take. But as Josh said, this is a very complex thing. It's not going to be done that well. We're talking about spent fuel rods. Where do you reprocess them in country? Do you take them out of country? The same thing with nuclear weapons. Where do you dismantle? Do you do it in country? A lot of issues. But the first step has to be, what are we talking about?
So Josh, we can't pin down to specific years?
No, I think you have to consider the diplomatic timeline. To negotiate this sort of process is going to take longer than the process itself. And I think that is what is reflected in the timeline that was published by Dr. Hecker and his Stanford colleagues, which is simply that if you look at the record of diplomacy with North Korea, it takes a long time to reach any agreement on anything, and then takes some time to reach an agreement on how the first agreement will be carried out. It is simply not an instantaneous process. There's a lot of mistrust built up. And working out the arrangements and their full extent and the verification methods, that is where the real long stretches of time are going to come from in this process. Having said that, if you look at the cooperative threat reduction programs that the United States and other countries undertook in the former Soviet republics, that went on for years and years. The work of dismantling missiles and blending down HEU went on for decades.
So political negotiations aside, how long will it take to dismantle key facilities like uranium centrifuge and plutonium reactors?
Well, I mean, it's that first you have to negotiate that. And as Josh indicated, there's a verification protocol that's very necessary because you'll need monitors on the ground to verify that North Korea is in compliance. It's a question of who's dismantling. Are we relying on the North Koreans to dismantle? Are we asking for the IAEA to come in? Are we looking at, nuclear weapon states who participate, let's say, in the six-party process? The UK, because that reactor is a graphite moderator reactor similar to the United Kingdom. So there are a lot of issues involved here. So I just wouldn't put a timeline on it.
In the sheer technical sense, just the dismantling itself, will it take so long?
One of the first things you would want to do at the site is to take samples so you can try to verify declarations of the past operational history of the facility. Then you would want to work out dismantling, disposal. Then there would probably be discussions of environmental cleanup. Just for example, the Hanford site in Washington State in the United States, where the United States produced plutonium for about 4+ decades, and stopped using actively in the 1980s, is still undergoing environmental cleanup. If that is considered part of the picture, then it could go on a long, long time at Yongbyon.
How much do we know about North Korean capabilities, like its stockpiles and its facilities, their secret facilities, and the stockpiles, the estimation, the warhead is anywhere between 20 to 60, right?
Right. Yes, I mean, 20 to 60 nuclear weapons. The question of facilities, I mean, how many is there? There are estimate to be over 10,000 underground facilities in North Korea. That's why the verification protocol is so important. If you're going to have monitors on the ground, and I might indicate that the 2005 joint statement and the six-party process failed on the question of verification. When we couldn't get North Korea to sign to permit monitors to visit non-declared suspect nuclear sites, because it's important to get out of Yongbyon and get out of those sites that they're pointing you to. So as you can take the samples, whether it's water, whether it's soil, and do some work. So there's a lot here, but it's the preliminary work, as you said, Josh, that's very necessary to understand what the playing field looks like, what the modalities are, and what the, if you will, what authorities do the monitors have, and our ability to take the samples out of the country to do the forensic work necessary.
Demands of verification become more stringent when you're trying to accomplish something like disarmament. If you're simply trying to shut down a certain set of facilities and not worry about the plutonium and highly enriched uranium they've produced in the past, verification's a lot easier. But if you are trying to chase down every last gram of material, then it becomes a lot harder. And your demands for access will increase accordingly. This is the crux of the verification issue, is how large are our ambitions? The next question is, if you have very complete ambitions for disarmament, but you can't get agreement on adequate verification, adequate access, in the short time, can you agree on a step-by-step process where you start with the facilities and then later move on to the accounting for the past stockpile? This gets complicated, but I think there may be more room diplomatically for taking a smaller bite at first, building trust, and then moving on to the harder problems.
When Secretary Pompeo last visited Pyongyang just recently, North Korea didn't come up with a timetable or a declaration list. Is it so difficult to come up with a timetable and the declaration list?
Again, I keep going back to the joint statement of 2005, because in it we had commitments for commitments, actions for actions. It's not going to be easy, but I think they can come up with a general timeline on when they can produce a comprehensive declaration and when they would be willing to sign and discuss before they sign a verification protocol. But I think they'll be looking for us to put something on the table also.
Mm-hmm. Right. They have objections to the vision of the sequencing that they're getting from the Americans. And we heard similar objections when National Security Advisor John Bolton was on television talking about the Libya model, where they said, we're not here to do unilateral disarmament. In other words, there's going to be a give and take, and both sides, or all three sides, including the South Koreans, will have a variety of commitments, and it will be this interactive process. After the Singapore summit, the North Koreans released a report giving their version of the interactions, claiming that the two leaders had agreed on a step-by-step process, which may imply that the bullet points in the Singapore summit statement have some sequencing to them, or simply that they will be taken bit by bit and not all in a big bite. So those steps were improving relations, instituting a peace regime, denuclearization, and location and transfer of Korean War remains. So in Kim Jong-un's letter to President Trump, that President Trump tweeted out yesterday, he emphasized, in fact, he mentioned only one of four, which was improving relations. That seems to suggest where he's coming from and the sorts of issues that he thinks need to be addressed first. Whereas Mike Pompeo, as far as we can tell, came in to talk about denuclearization and perhaps the return of Korean War remains, so that the third and fourth bullets on the list. It just seems to me that we're not fully on the same page when it comes to what issues should be addressed first and how vigorously.
Mm-hmm. Before we go, last question, we're not on the same page. So what should be the goal for the working group that's been established? What should the US side try to get from North Korea early on?
Well, that's exactly it. That's the purpose of the working group. I mean, we've been here. We've been doing this for 25 years with North Korea. So when we talk about, what does denuclearization mean, we know what it means. I think the North Koreans know what we know it to mean. It's their commitment on that. So the working group really has to really drill down on how do we get that verification agreement signed? How do we, and what's included in it? The same thing on the declaration immediately, but also the question of reciprocity. How do we factor in the process towards normalization of relations, possibly liaison offices in the respective capitals? The same thing with ending the Korean War.
If you could just put it in one sentence, what should be the goal?
Let's focus on facilities first. That is something that the North Koreans have been willing to do in the past.
We'll wrap this discussion here and move on to our next segment.
President Trump believes your country can replicate this path. It's yours if you'll seize the moment. The miracle could be yours.
Secretary Pompeo said North Korean leader Kim Jong-un should replicate Vietnam's miracle of economic growth by improving ties with the United States, vowing America keeps its promises with former foes. Now, why do you think Secretary Pompeo promoted Vietnamese model for North Korea?
The focus on the market economy, moving away from that element of Marxism. And we're seeing a bit of that in North Korea now, where there's more of marketization kicking in. Obviously, it's not comprehensive enough. So that's the element of capitalism, where you can still retain, if you will, the element of Leninism. You can still retain the central's leadership control, and then you could sort of decentralize, and you could have a market economy, and you can get foreign direct investment, and you could start moving things forward. And I think Vietnam's a model, China's a model, but I think North Korea is a unique model. So I'm not sure you could emulate per se, but there are some examples of how places like Vietnam and China, China with Deng Xiaoping, were successful in moving away from that element of central control, if you will, the Marxism element of Marxism-Leninism, and still keeping central leadership control.
I agree completely with the ambassador that what the Americans are getting at is this concept of so-called market Leninism, where the regime remains in place, but it liberalizes its economy. The North Koreans look at this, and they have two reactions. One is they don't like to be compared with anybody. They make these grand claims to originality, and they don't like to be presented as following someone else's model. But second, they look at the reform and opening up under Deng Xiaoping and similar ideas under Mikhail Gorbachev, and they see formula for disaster in their view because of a loss of ideological control. So whatever they do, and they clearly do want to rebuild their economy, they're going to do it in a manner that they feel comfortable with. And so when Mike Pompeo and Donald Trump talk about helping them to prosper, they are a little suspicious of what that means. They are no longer demanding any type of aid from the United States. In past agreements, they would demand energy aid, particularly in the form of light water reactors and fuel oil supplies and the like. That's not featured in the Singapore agreement. They have moved past that.
Right.
And I think Kim Jong-un really would like to see the forms of foreign investment that they're already comfortable with, working with the Chinese, working with the South Koreans in these closed-off enclaves, and also adding to that more foreign tourism. I think they can look at the example of the Cubans as a fellow socialist country that has successfully managed an influx of foreign tourists without experiencing too much of a threat to regime control.
Ambassador, do you see any parallels or differences between North Korea and Vietnam's situation in opening up?
Well, totally different. I mean, there's no question. I think the element of commonality is, I mean, you go to a market economy, you lose that central control, and certainly North Korea is moving in that direction. Public distribution system doesn't exist any longer. The central government really can't take care of the people. So we see a little private plots and some incentivization going on immediately. So yeah, Vietnam different. I mean, there was a war with Vietnam. Vietnam came together. There is central control there. But I think the key is making it clear that if North Korea opens up to the international community, to international financial institutions, where they can get foreign direct investment, where they can get that interaction, as you mentioned, Josh, as they're doing with China, but do that with South Korea, do it with Japan, do it with certainly the United States, other countries, the European Union. That would sort of give them that economic development that the key here is that Kim Jong-un is talking about. I mean, this is why we think, and I'm one of them who believes that, and Kim Jong-un has said it, he's made a strategic decision to focus on the economy, to improve the livelihood of the people. I mean, compared to South Korea, I mean, the gap is immense. So he wants to focus on it, and to do that, that's the path they need to take.
Before we go, Mr. Pollack, just briefly, do you also see that determination in Kim Jong-un that he wants to develop his economy and give a better life to his people?
Absolutely. It's his major priority right now. I think this is why he's willing to move away from nuclear and missile testing, to lower the profile of his arsenal, but then to build on that foundation of security, a new structure of economic progress. How is he going to go about doing it is the question, and I think he's going to dip his toes into this process, not giving away too much, not taking a leap of faith, but tiptoeing into it using special economic zones and the like.
Well, we'll end this conversation here. Ambassador Detrani, Mr. Pollack, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjung Cho. Join us again next week for more analysis on North Korea.